Mortal Kombat 1 for the Nintendo Switch is now the cheapest that it's ever been. So is this game still worth buying on the Nintendo Switch 2 in 2026? That's what we're going to find out in today's video. I'm going to take you through how it performs with up-to-date graphics and frame rate comparisons. I'm going to be comparing how the day 1 patch runs compared to the final 1.29 update on the old Nintendo Switch, and then I'm going to compare that to how it runs on the Nintendo Switch 2. I also finally learned how to use a proper frame rate analyzing tool, so that's what I'm going to be using for the frame rate comparisons. So hit the like button to support the channel, leave a comment down below to let the algorithm know you want more, and back to the video. So if you're a newcomer and you're wondering, should I buy Mortal Kombat 1 for my Nintendo Switch 2 right now that it's only $8, let me take you through a few of the changes that this game has seen. This is what Mileena and many other characters looked like in this game when it launched in 2023. As you can see, the game had a lot of issues in the area of graphics. Mileena, for example, was missing her tongue and the two separating folds on the sides of her mouth. Needless to say, the game was definitely released unfinished. On top of that, textures would often fail to load, making the game look very ugly. Here is what Mileena looks like now in the final version running on Nintendo Switch 2. When it comes to the visuals of the game, it should go without saying that the Switch version was never ever gonna look as good as it does on the PlayStation 5. However, compared to what it looked like when it first released, the final build of Mortal Kombat 1 on Nintendo Switch looks 10 times better. Stages also received many improvements. When it launched, Sun Do had no NPCs in the background, now it does. Now let's take a look at the most important part of a fighting game, the performance. Let's start with something that was a major problem when the game first launched, and that's how slow the character selection menu was. Keep in mind, cutscenes and menus run at 30 frames per second on all versions of MK1. That is not a Switch only thing. But in the launch version of Mortal Kombat 1 for the Switch, the game struggled to maintain even just 30 frames in the character selection menu. Cycling through the characters often brought the game to a halt, but in later patches that was mostly fixed. And on the Nintendo Switch 2, as you can see, the game maintains a very stable 30 frames per second. Now let's look at gameplay. Here is me performing some high damage combos as Liu Kang to see how the game is able to handle it. In the original version, the game mostly stays around 60 frames per second, but anytime a support character, aka a cameo, is on screen, the game automatically cuts to 30 frames per second. This was worked on in later patches, but by the time they stopped working on the Switch 1 version, cameos still made the frame rate drop a little bit. However, if you play MK1 on the Nintendo Switch 2, that frame rate drop is pretty much eliminated. Fatalities also struggle to run in the Day 1 edition of the game, Johnny Cage's being one of the most notorious ones, but now, and especially on the Nintendo Switch 2, they run at a near perfect 30 frames per second. The T-1000 had a few moves that made the game drop to 40 frames per second on the old Nintendo Switch, and that issue unfortunately was never fixed, and at this point I don't think it will be. But on the Nintendo Switch 2, his hook swords run at a perfect 60 frames per second, as you can see. Now let's check online gameplay. This is a full online ranked match I had in Mortal Kombat 1. I'm the Liu Kang player, my opponent is Smoke. I was running the game on my Nintendo Switch 2, and I am 99% positive my opponent was running the game on the old Nintendo Switch because it took a very long time to load. If we were both running this game on Nintendo Switch 2, it would have taken about 10 seconds. Instead of however long this took. For future reference, online casual matches in the current version of Mortal Kombat 1 when it's played on the old Nintendo Switch will load in at about 15 to 20 seconds. Ranked matches take about 35 seconds to load. On the Nintendo Switch 2, casual matches load in at about 5 seconds and ranked matches take about 10 seconds. As far as the performance goes, as you can see, the game stays around 60 frames most of the time, dropping slightly whenever heavy action occurs. The biggest drop occurs when the Smoke player hits me with the Darius spinning throw, dropping everything to 30 frames for the duration of that move. But the game returns to 60 frames while I'm still in the knockdown animation. Aside from that moment, the game maintained around 60 frames, never dropping below 55. Again, aside from that one Darius move. I should remind you my opponent was running this on the old Nintendo Switch, so I was curious if that drop would still happen if the old Switch was not a factor. Here you can see me trying out a few of Darius's moves, including the spinning throw, and just like I thought, the Switch 2 is able to run this with no problem. It still maintains around 60, dropping maybe 2 or 3 frames for a second before going back to 60. In conclusion, if you're buying this game on the Nintendo Switch 2, you can consider it an ugly version that runs just as well as on the Xbox Series. Gameplay is very smooth, cameos don't bring down the action at all, and the T1000 runs very smoothly. The resolution does not drop and maintains clarity at all times. Online matches are where things get a little bit tricky because if you run into someone who is playing this game on the old Nintendo Switch, your mileage may vary. It could be a very bad connection or it could be pretty good. I'm someone with over 1,000 hours playing this game online on the old Nintendo Switch, and in my opinion, the online was always mostly good, aside from those first few weeks before they started patching it. If you run into someone online who's playing on the Switch 2, which is not uncommon now, you can expect a very smooth experience. If you're buying this game on the old Nintendo Switch, you can expect many improvements over what it was like before. Textures no longer fail to load, so everything looks a little bit nicer. The resolution drops quite a bit during heavy action sequences and in demanding stages. You can also expect more frame rate drops like what we saw with the Darius footage. All in all, the online match footage that you saw earlier is what you can generally expect if you and your opponent are both playing on a decent connection. On the Switch 1, you can also expect a lot more waiting on loading screens than on the Switch 2.
Earthrealm's protector.
Round 2.